They tell you the Black Templars are the Emperor's chosen. They don't tell you what it costs. Sleep becomes prayer. Prayer becomes pain. And the man you used to be, he doesn't survive initiation. This is what happens when faith demands you kill the part of yourself that feels fear, doubt, or mercy. The question is, when the war is over and you've won, will there be anything left inside that armor worth saving? I no longer remember the face I wore before the black and white. That is not poetic exaggeration or the theatrical melancholy of a penitent seeking absolution through confession. It is simple fact delivered with the same flat certainty I would use to describe the color of my armor or the weight of my blade. I stood before a polished shard of steel 3 days ago, attempting to recall the features I possessed before my initiation into the ranks of the eternal crusade, and found nothing but absence where memory should have resided. The reflection showed me what I am now, a face hardened into angles, eyes narrowed to judgmental slits, scars forming a topography of devotion across skin that no longer belonged to whoever I had been. Brother Templar Roderick Vane. They call me. The name feels borrowed, a title pinned to something that has replaced rather than evolved from my former self. I accepted it anyway because acceptance is obedience. And obedience is all that remains when everything else has been methodically stripped away. The oath unbroken is a cathedral that moves through the void. Its corridors stretch for kilometers in every direction. Vast avenues of stone and iron where the architecture itself becomes a sermon. Gothic arches soar overhead, their ribbed vaults disappearing into shadows that electric lumens cannot fully dispel. Every surface bears devotional script in High Gothic, Low Gothic, and languages so ancient their meanings have been lost to all but the most learned chaplain. Yet we are expected to mouth the syllables during our processionals anyway. Faith requiring no comprehension to be valid. The air tastes of incense and recycled breath. Metallic undertones mixing with the perpetual smell of weapon oil and the faint copper scent that never quite leaves spaces where warriors gather. Servitors drift through the halls on appointed routes, their augmented bodies fused with sacred machinery, mumbling binary prayers that blend with the ever-present thrum of plasma drives. I walk these corridors 16 hours of every day, and sleep is a luxury park-let out in 2-hour increments, less a period of rest than a mandatory cessation of consciousness before the cycle begins again. Prayer is not optional, and it is not brief. The first vigil begins at what would be dawn if such a concept held meaning in the endless night of void travel. We gather in the chapel of the unyielding vow, a chamber large enough to hold 3,000 armored bodies, yet somehow still feeling cramped when filled with the brotherhood. The chaplain's voice echoes from vaulted heights, leading us through the litany of hate, and we respond in perfect unison, our voices merging into a single instrument of devotion. The words are familiar now, burned into neural pathways through repetition until they emerge without conscious thought. We hate the witch. We hate the mutant. We hate the heretic. We hate the Xenos. We hate weakness. We hate doubt. We hate ourselves when we falter. The litany continues for 2 hours without pause. My knees ache against the stone floor. Sweat gathers beneath my robes despite the chill that pervades every corner of the ship. Others show no sign of discomfort, their faces set in expressions of rapturous concentration. And so I force my own features into similar configuration, knowing that any visible weakness invites correction. Correction comes in many forms aboard the oath unbroken. Sometimes it is verbal, a sword brother noting insufficient zeal in your recitations and demanding you repeat the offending prayer 100 times while the others proceed to the next devotion. Sometimes it is physical, the penitent flagellation that follows any lapse in discipline. The whip's kiss across your back, a reminder that pain is the currency through which we purchase purity. Sometimes it is isolation, hours spent alone in a meditation cell with nothing but your failures and the Emperor's silent judgment. The absence of brotherhood, a torment far worse than any blow. I have experienced all 3 forms in my first month aboard this vessel. The scars have begun to form. thin white lines crisscrossing my shoulders and upper back. A map of my inadequacies etched in scar tissue. I am told they will fade with time, replaced by newer marks. The process continuing until my entire body becomes a palimpsest of devotion. The distinction between meditation and torture has grown unclear. We are led to the contemplation chambers after the morning prayers. Space is barely large enough to contain a standing human form lit by a single flickering candle that provides just enough illumination to see the icon of the god emperor bolted to the opposite wall. The chamber door closes. The silence that follows is absolute, broken only by your own breathing and the distant vibration of the ship's engines transmitted through the hull. You are meant to contemplate your unworthiness, to catalog every impure thought that has crossed your mind since your last confession, to hold each sin up to the Emperor's light and see yourself as you truly are, flawed, insufficient, saved only by His grace and your willingness to obliterate every part of yourself that might disappoint Him. Hours pass. The candle burns lower. Your legs begin to shake from standing so long in one position, but sitting would be surrender, and surrender is unthinkable. Some initiates emerge from these sessions with tears streaming down their faces, overwhelmed by visions of their own inadequacy. Others come out silent and cold, having successfully murdered another piece of their humanity. I learned quickly that questions are heresies waiting to be born. During my second week aboard the Oath Unbroken, I made the mistake of asking Sword Brother Kale why we devoted so many hours to prayer when we might use that time to train for the battles ahead. His response was immediate and merciless, a backhand that split my lip, followed by a command to prostrate myself before the nearest shrine and beg the Emperor's forgiveness for my arrogance. I complied, pressing my forehead to the cold deck plates, tasting blood on my tongue, while Kale recited the catechism of humility above me. The other initiates watched without expression, learning the same lesson through my punishment. When Kale finally permitted me to rise, he explained in a voice devoid of anger that training prepares the body, but prayer prepares the soul, and a warrior with an impure soul is already lost regardless of his martial skill. He did not explain how one might distinguish between a question born of genuine desire for understanding and one that harbored the seeds of doubt. I suspect the distinction does not exist in the doctrine of the Black Templars, that all questioning is inherently suspect, that absolute certainty is the only acceptable state of mind. The ship's bells mark time in increments of devotion rather than hours. 7 times each day, the great bronze bells in the central nave ring out, their tones reverberating through the hull, calling us to different forms of worship. The bell of dawn hatred summons us to renew our oaths of enmity against the enemies of mankind. The bell of martial purity signals weapons training, where we practice the holy art of slaughter under the watchful eyes of our superiors. The bell of confession brings us to the chaplains of loves, where we kneel in darkness and whisper our sins through ornate grills, hearing in return either absolution or the command to perform penance. Each bell becomes a Pavlovian trigger, my body responding before my mind fully processes the sound. Muscle memory developing around the rhythms of faith. I have ceased thinking in terms of morning or evening, hunger or satiety. There is only the next bell, the next duty, the next opportunity to prove myself worthy of the armor I do not yet possess. Food is fuel, and fuel is rationed according to spiritual merit. The refectory is a long hall lined with wooden tables worn smooth by centuries of use. The walls decorated with murals depicting the Emperor's ascension and the Primarch's triumphs. We eat in silence, forbidden from conversing while taking sustenance. The only sounds the scrape of utensils against metal plates and the quiet footsteps of servitors delivering rations. The meal itself is nutritionally optimized but deliberately unpleasant. A gray paste that tastes of minerals and processing, supplemented by hard biscuits that require significant effort to chew and water that carries a faint metallic tang. Those who have distinguished themselves through exceptional devotion receive slightly larger portions. Those who have faltered eat less. The message is clear. Even the basic necessities of survival are privileges granted by the Emperor through the mediation of our superiors, not rights we can claim by virtue of existing. I have learned to eat quickly, and without complaint to empty my plate regardless of my body's protests, to view hunger as another form of penitent suffering. Sleep comes in fragments, and dreams are suspect. The dormitory contains rows of narrow cots arranged with military precision, each separated by exactly 1 meter of space, no privacy permitted, and none desired. We sleep in our robes, forbidden from undressing fully, even in rest. The fabric rough against skin that has grown sensitized through constant exposure to discomfort. The lights never fully extinguish, dimming to a twilight glow that allows the night watch to observe us for any signs of corruption or weakness. I have learned to fall asleep instantly when given the opportunity, a skill born of desperation rather than discipline. My body surrendering to unconsciousness the moment horizontal surface becomes available. Dreams still come, unbidden and unwelcome. Fragments of memories that feel like they belong to someone else. A woman's laugh, sunlight on water, the taste of fruit I cannot name. I wake from these visions in cold sweat, terrified that someone might have heard me murmur something incriminating in my sleep, scanning the darkness for any sign that my subconscious has betrayed me. The training cages are where theory becomes practice. They occupy an entire deck of the ship, vast chambers where we learn to kill with every weapon the Imperium has sanctified for our use. Chainswords roar as we practice the 17 sacred forms of close combat, the blade's teeth screaming as they bite into combat. Servitors reprogram to fight back with lethal intent. Bolt pistols thunder in the firing ranges, their explosive rounds punching fist-sized craters in reinforced targets. The recoil traveling up your arm like the Emperor's own wrath made kinetic. Combat knives flash in close-quarters drills, the movements becoming meditative in their precision. Each strike a prayer offered through violence. The instructors are sword brothers who have survived decades of crusading. Their bodies collections of scars and augmentics. Their voices harsh with criticism that never softens into praise. Good performance earns silence. Excellence earns a curt nod. Failure earns correction, the form it takes depending on the severity of your inadequacy. I killed my first surf tour on my 19th day aboard. It was a training exercise, a combat scenario designed to test our ability to function under stress. The surf tour had been programmed with the attack patterns of an orc warrior, its augmented strength, allowing it to swing a massive cleaver with bone-crushing force. We faced them in pairs, armed only with training blades and our faith. My partner was an initiate named Petrin, a youth who had joined the crusade from a hive world I had never heard of, his body already bearing the scars of previous training sessions. The surf tour came at us with simulated berserker rage, and we responded as Tort, flanking it, waiting for openings, striking when vulnerabilities presented themselves. I drove my blade into the gap between its shoulder and neck, severing something critical, and the surf tour collapsed in a heap of twitching and leaking fluids. The instructor called it adequate. Petrin clapped me on the shoulder, his eyes bright with adrenaline. I felt nothing except the elevated heart rate returning to normal and the ache in my sword arm from the impact. That absence of feeling troubled me more than the kill itself. I lay in my cot that night, staring at the dimmed lights overhead, trying to recall if I had ever felt joy or sorrow or fear with any intensity. The memories were there, faint impressions of emotions experienced before my initiation, but they seemed abstract now, like stories someone had told me about a stranger. I remembered being afraid of the dark as a child, but could no longer conjure the actual sensation of that fear. I remembered laughing at something, but the memory contained no echo of genuine mirth. It was as if those emotional responses had been surgically extracted, leaving only the factual recollection that they had once existed. I wondered if this was intentional, if the endless prayers and meditations and flagellations were designed not just to strengthen faith, but to systematically dismantle the self until nothing remained but a weapon shaped like a man. The realization should have horrified me. Instead, it arrived with the same emotional neutrality that colored everything else, an observation noted and filed away without the appropriate response that should have accompanied it. I was becoming something other than human, and I could not summon the will to resist because resistance required caring about what was being lost, and caring was precisely the capacity being eroded. The paradox formed a perfect trap. By the time you noticed what was happening, you had already lost the ability to object to it meaningfully. I turned my face to the wall and waited for sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring the same rituals, the same prayers, the same gradual dissolution of whatever Roderick Vane had been before the black and white claimed him. The chaplain watched us with eyes that never blink. They moved through the ship like black-clad specters, their skull helms creating the impression of death, passing judgment on the living. Their Crozius Arcanum crackling with barely contained power. Chaplain Grimaldus, who serves as our primary spiritual overseer, conducts weekly examinations where he probes our faith with questions designed to expose any hairline fractures in our certainty. He asks why we hate, and we must answer with specific enumeration of enemies and their corruptions. He asks what we would sacrifice for the Emperor, and the only acceptable answer is everything, including our lives, our souls, our very capacity for independent thought. He asks if we have experienced doubts, and here the trap reveals itself. Answering no suggests arrogance, the belief that you are somehow immune to the temptations that assail all servants of the throne, while answering yes requires immediate confession and penance. I have learned to answer yes, but to frame my doubts as infinitesimally small momentary flickers immediately extinguished by the light of faith. Treasonous impulses crushed before they could fully form. Whether this is true or merely strategic, I can no longer say. The line between genuine belief and performance has blurred to the point of invisibility. Each hour of prayer reinforcing neural pathways until the doctrines become reflexive rather than considered. When I recite the Emperor's glory, am I expressing authentic devotion or simply activating the verbal patterns that have been burned into my brain through repetition? When I prostrate myself before the altars, is my humility real or theater performed for an audience of one? The questions themselves feel like heresies, suggesting, as they do, that faith might require examination, that belief should be chosen rather than compelled. I push them down into the same dark space where other dangerous thoughts accumulate, unexamined and unresolved. A growing mass of suppressed uncertainty that lurks beneath the surface of my practice certainty. The announcement came during the 4th week. We were going to war. The fleet had translated back into real space near a world called Sanctus Lashima, a shrine world that had fallen to heresy. Its sacred temples desecrated by cultists who had turned from the Emperor's light to worship darker powers. The details emerged in fragments during briefings conducted in the Strategium, a vast chamber dominated by holithic displays showing orbital views of the planet below. Sanctus Lachma had been a place of pilgrimage, millions traveling there each year to venerate relics of saints and martyrs. Its surface covered in cathedrals and monasteries and meditation gardens. 6 months ago, contact had ceased. Investigation revealed the planet's corruption. Its population either slaughtered or converted. Its holy places transformed into altars of blasphemy. Our crusade fleet had been diverted from its primary route to cleanse this infection before it could spread further. The briefing was delivered without emotional inflection. Marshal Adelard, commander of our contingent, outlined the tactical situation with the dispassionate precision of a craftsman describing his tools. The heretics numbered in the tens of thousands, concentrated primarily in the larger temple complexes. Orbital bombardment had been deemed unsuitable due to the sacred nature of the architecture, the structures too holy to destroy, even in their corrupted state. Instead, we would conduct ground assaults, purging the temples room by room, killing every heretic we encountered and reclaiming the shrines for the Emperor. Resistance would be fanatical. Casualties were expected. The honor of first assault would go to the initiates. Our blood christening the campaign, our lives expendable currency spent to purchase glory for the chapter. I listened without expression, aware that fear would be visible to those watching, and fear was incompatible with the zeal expected of a Black Templar. Others showed eagerness that might have been genuine or might have been strategic. Petron's hands trembled with what could have been anticipation or terror, the distinction difficult to pass from external observation alone. Initiate Cassin, a towering youth who spoke rarely and prayed constantly, nodded along with each point of the briefing, as though receiving communion. Initiate Drev, who had received more corrections than any of us, and bore the scars to prove it, stared at the Holiths with eyes that reflected the burning cities below, his jaw set in an expression of rigid determination. We were 200 initiates preparing for our baptism in fire. None of us yet worthy of power armor, equipped instead with carapace plate and faith, our weapons blessed, but our bodies fragile. The statistics suggested that half of us would not survive the campaign. The doctrine suggested that our survival was irrelevant compared to our devotion. The weapons we received were relics of previous crusades. Each bolt pistol had a history inscribed on its casing, names of previous bearers who had wielded it in battle, most of those names ending with the date and location of their deaths. My assigned weapon had been carried by 7 different warriors, 3 of them initiates who had fallen during their first deployments, their service measured in hours rather than years. I held the pistol in both hands, feeling its weight, reading the inscriptions by the dim light of the armory, trying to summon some connection to these dead warriors whose only legacy was a name on a gun. The weight of their expectations settled on my shoulders alongside the weight of the weapon itself, the knowledge that I was merely the latest in a chain of expendable souls, my own name destined to join theirs when my time came. The chainsaw felt more personal, more intimate in its violence. Its teeth were blessed individually, each adamantium fang receiving a drop of sacred oil and a whispered prayer from the armory's presiding priest. When activated, the blade would scream with righteous fury. It sung a hymn to the Emperor's wrath. I practiced the activation sequence until it became automatic, the blade roaring to life and falling silent in response to my will, its weight becoming familiar through repetition. The Sword Brothers, who oversaw our preparation, emphasized that the chainsaw was not merely a weapon, but an instrument of judgment. Each kill a sacrament performed in the Emperor's name. We must hate what we killed, they insisted, not with a hot anger of personal grievance, but with the cold purity of theological necessity. Our blades extensions of divine were rather than tools of mere murder. The difference, they assured us, was everything. I tried to understand the distinction, to grasp how hatred could be simultaneously cold and pure, how one might kill without rage, yet still with sufficient fervor to qualify as righteous. The theology seemed paradoxical, demanding intense emotion while forbidding the loss of control that intense emotion typically produced. We were to be passionate without passion, furious without fury, devoted to slaughter, while maintaining the discipline of monks. The contradiction never resolved itself, remaining instead as another question I could not ask. Another doubt I pushed down into that growing darkness where all my uncertainties festered. The drop pods were coffins that fell screaming from the sky. We packed ourselves into their narrow interiors, 20 initiates per pod, standing in harnesses that would barely protect us from the violence of atmospheric entry and impact. The interior walls were inscribed with prayers, the words glowing faintly in the darkness, providing the only illumination once the hatches sealed. The air grew hot and thin as the pod detached from the ship, gravity asserting itself, the restraints biting into my shoulders as we plummeted towards Sanctus Lacrima. Around me, my brothers recited the litany of descent, their voices merging into a single chant that competed with a shriek of tortured metal and superheated air. I joined them, mouthing words that required no conscious thought, the prayer serving as distraction from the knowledge that we were essentially unarmored humans, hurtling toward a surface at terminal velocity in a container that might or might not survive the landing. The impact drove the breath from my lungs. Retro thrusters fired at the last possible moment, slowing our descent just enough to prevent the pod from becoming a crater and our bodies from becoming paste. We hit hard anyway, the shock traveling up through my legs and spine, teeth clicking together hard enough to draw blood. The harnesses released automatically. The hatches blew outward in clouds of explosive bolts and smoke. Light and sound flooded in. The gray sky of Sanctus Rima. The smell of ash and burning promethium. The crack of gunfire and the screams of the dying. We poured out of the pod into a courtyard surrounded by Gothic architecture. Our boots hitting stone that had been worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims' feet. And the enemy was already upon us. Heretics emerged from doorways and windows like insects from disturbed nests. They wore the ragged remains of pilgrim robes, their faces painted with obscene symbols, their mouths open in wordless shrieks of hatred. Some carried crude weapons, clubs and knives, and sharpened stakes. Others wielded autoguns looted from the shrine's security forces, their shots wild, but numerous enough to be dangerous. They came at us in a wave of bodies and bullets, and we met them with blade and bolt, our training overriding the fear that should have paralyzed us. I fired my pistol into the mass of charging heretics. Each shot a small explosion of gore and bone, the recoil of familiar violence in my hands. Beside me, Petrin activated his chainsaw and waded into the melee, the blade's teeth chewing through flesh with wet enthusiasm. The battle became a series of disconnected moments rather than a coherent narrative. A heretic's face exploding as my bolt punched through his skull. The spray of arterial blood as my chainsaw opened another throat. The impact of an autogun round against my carapace, the armor holding, but the force bruising ribs beneath. The screaming constant and overlapping, impossible to distinguish whether it came from enemies or brothers or my own throat. The smell of open bodies and burning incense mixing into a nauseating cocktail that coated the back of my tongue. Somewhere to my left, an initiate went down under a pile of heretics, his screams cutting off abruptly. Somewhere to my right, Sword Brother Kale roared the litany of hate while his power fist pulverized corrupted flesh. The courtyard became a slaughterhouse, blood turning the ancient stone slick, bodies piling up faster than they could fall. And through it all, I felt nothing but focused clarity. This should have disturbed me more than it did. This absence of the terror or exhilaration that combat supposedly inspired. But in the moment, there was only the next target, the next threat, the next opportunity to prove myself worthy through violence. My movements were precise, economical, each strike calculated for maximum efficiency. I was not consumed by bloodlust or rage. I was simply executing a task, performing a duty. My body moving through the mechanics of slaughter with the same methodical dedication I brought to prayer. The heretics died beneath my blade, and I noted their deaths with the same emotional investment I might give to counting inventory. The thought arrived unbidden. I have become a machine shaped like a man. The courtyard fell silent except for the moans of the dying and the low rumble of idling chains. We had won, if such a term could be applied to mutual butchery, where our victory was measured by slightly fewer dead among our own ranks than theirs. I counted the initiates still standing, 15 of our original 20, 3 of the 5 losses occurring in the first moments of contact, the other 2 somewhere during the chaotic melee. Their bodies lay crumpled among the heretics, indistinguishable in death from the enemy, except for the color of their carapace. No one moved to retrieve them. No one spoke prayers over their corpses. We reloaded our weapons and advanced into the temple, leaving our dead where they had fallen. The temple interior was a cathedral of desecration. What had once been a magnificent shrine dedicated to Saint Celestine now bore the marks of profound corruption. Its holy icons smashed or defaced, its walls painted with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Angular geometries that seemed to writhe when viewed peripherally. The air itself felt wrong, too thick, too warm, carrying scents that had no place in reality. Somewhere deep in the structure, voices chanted in languages that predated human speech. The words resonating in frequencies that made my teeth ache. We advanced in disciplined formation, Sword Brother Kale at our head. Our weapons trained on every shadow, every alcove, every potential ambush point. The heretics attacked in waves, each assault more frenzied than the last. They poured from side chapels and maintenance passages, their numbers seemingly endless, their desperation growing as we pushed deeper into the temple complex. We killed them by the dozen, by the score, our bolters barking thunder, and our chainsaws singing hymns of ending. The floor grew slick with blood and other fluids. Spent shell casings clinked against stone in a metallic rain. The air grew hazy with gun smoke and the steam rising from open bodies. My armor was painted red to the elbows. My face spattered with matter I refused to identify. I had stopped counting my kills after the first hour, the numbers becoming meaningless, each death blending into the next, until they formed a single continuous act of violence stretched across time. In the heart of the temple, we found the source of the corruption. A chamber that had once housed the saints' reliquary now contained an altar built from shattered statues and human bones. Its surface dark with old blood, its base surrounded by the kneeling forms of cultists deep in prayer. At the altar's center stood a robed figure whose face was hidden beneath a mask fashioned from hammered gold. The features twisted into an expression of ecstatic agony. This was the cult's leader, the heresy arch who had turned an entire world from the Emperor's light. Kale raised his bolt pistol without ceremony and fired the explosive round, crossing the distance in a fraction of a second. The heresy raised one hand and the bolt stopped in midair. It hung suspended between us, rotating slowly, the explosive warhead clearly visible. Physics itself subverted by some unseen power. The masked figure's laughter echoed through the chamber, a sound that seemed to come from multiple throats simultaneously. Around the altar, the cultists raised their heads, and I saw that their eyes had been replaced by smaller mouths, tiny orifices that opened and closed in rhythms synchronized with the heresy's laughter. Kale roared a prayer and charged forward, his power fist crackling with energy. The rest of us followed, faith overriding the horror of what we witnessed. The battle that followed defied rational description. The heresy arc moved with impossible speed, teleporting between locations, striking from angles that should not have existed. The cultists transformed, their bodies elongating and twisting into shapes that rejected anatomy, limbs sprouting from torsos, and additional heads budding from shoulders. Reality itself seemed negotiable in that chamber. The walls breathing, the floor becoming liquid and then solid again, gravity shifting direction without warning. We fought against impossible odds, using nothing but faith and fury. Our weapons, the only constants in a space where everything else had become subject to revision. I saw Initiate Cassin torn apart by forces I could not see. His body pulled in opposite directions until it came apart like wet paper. I saw Petrin dragged into a wall that opened like a mouth and closed behind him, his screams cutting off the moment the stone sealed. I saw Kale grappling with the heresiarch. The two of them locked in combat that shattered stone and bent metal. The Sword Brothers' strength barely matching whatever unholy power animated his opponent. And I saw my opportunity. While the heresy focused on Kale, I circled around the altar, activating my chainsaw, racing forward with every ounce of speed my augmented biology could muster. The blade drove into the heresiarch's back, punching through robes and flesh and bone, the teeth chewing through spine with mechanical efficiency. The masked figure stiffened, that terrible laughter cutting off abruptly. I pulled the trigger again, revving the blade higher, feeling it bite deeper. Blood the color of spoiled milk, fontaining from the wound. The heresy reached back with one twisted hand, fingers elongated into talons, gouging across my face, tearing furrows through my cheek and jaw. But the damage was done. The hairy Zarch collapsed, the body hitting the floor with a sound like breaking pottery, something fundamental within its shattering. The cultists shrieked in unison, their transformation reversing catastrophically, bodies collapsing into puddles of undifferentiated matter that spread across the floor like spilled oil. The chamber itself shuddered, the walls cracking, the breathing rhythm faltering. Kal grabbed my shoulder with his power fist. The weapon deactivated now, pulling me back from the altar as the entire structure began to collapse around us. We ran through corridors that were disintegrating, stone turning to sand, support beams cracking and falling, the temple destroying itself now that its corrupting heart had been torn out. Behind us, I heard the screams of initiates who had not moved fast enough, their voices cut short as they were buried beneath the collapse. We burst out into daylight just as the entire central dome imploded, a cloud of dust and debris washing over us like a wave. When the air cleared, the temple was rubble, and we were 12 where we had been 20. Our victory purchased with blood and the lives of those who would never be remembered except as names in a casualty report. The campaign continued for 6 more weeks. We moved from temple to temple across Sanctus Lacrima, purging each site of corruption, killing thousands of heretics, suffering losses that were acceptable only because the doctrine defined them as such. Each battle followed the same pattern: brutal assault, close-quarter slaughter, Pyrrhic victory. The names of the dead became a litany I recited during the evening prayers. Each name a life reduced to a syllable, a soul reduced to a statistic. Petrin, Cassin, Drev, Initiate Corvus, Initiate Sand, Initiate Helm. The list grew longer with each engagement, and I felt nothing with each addition. The deaths registering as factual occurrences devoid of emotional weight. This absence began to trouble me in ways I could not articulate. I had known these warriors, trained beside them, eaten with them, prayed with them, and now they were gone, and I felt no grief. I searched for sadness, for loss, for some evidence that their deaths meant something to me beyond tactical inconvenience, and found only emptiness where such feelings should have resided. During meditation, I tried to force emotion, to manufacture appropriate responses through sheer will, but the exercise proved futile. The capacity for grief had been excised from me as thoroughly as doubt or fear, and without it, I was becoming something that terrified me more than any heretic, a hollow thing wearing human shape. The whispers started during the 7th week. At first, I dismissed them as auditory hallucinations brought on by fatigue and stress, the mind-generating phantom sounds to fill the silence of ruined temples. But they persisted, growing clearer with each passing day. Words spoken in voices I almost recognized, sentences that seemed to emerge from the mouths of shattered icons and broken statues. They spoke of doubt, of questions I had suppressed, of the parts of myself I had murdered in pursuit of purity. They asked if I was certain the Emperor demanded such sacrifice, if faith required the annihilation of everything that made me human, if perhaps the Black Templars had mistaken zealotry for devotion. I tried to ignore them, to drown them out with prayer, but they adapted. The whispers learned to speak between the words of my litties, inserting themselves into the gaps and pauses, a counterpoint to the official doctrine that corrupted every devotion I attempted. I would recite the litany of hate, and the whispers would ask what I was actually hating, whether it was the enemy or myself, the heretic or the man I used to be. I would meditate on purity, and the whispers would note that purity achieved through destruction was just another form of corruption. The soul raised to bedrock and left barren. I would contemplate the Emperor's glory, and the whispers would wonder if glory purchased with the extinction of self was worth the price. Each whisper felt like treason blooming in my mind. I knew intellectually that this was corruption, that the heretical taint we had been purging from the temples was now attempting to infiltrate my thoughts, to turn me against my brothers and my faith. I knew the proper response was immediate confession, frustration before the chaplain, penance performed until the doubts had been scoured clean. But I also knew with terrible certainty that confession would not silence the whispers, because the whispers were not external corruption, but internal truth. My own suppressed thoughts given voice through the medium of fatigue and trauma. The realization was paralyzing. If the whispers were mine, then I was already corrupted. My faith already compromised. My purity already lost. If the whispers were mine, then confession would not save me, but condemn me, marking me as unfit for the brotherhood, a weapon too flawed to be trusted. If the whispers were mine, then I had 2 choices: hide the corruption and hope it did not spread, or embrace it and see where it led. The third option, of course, was to excise the corrupted part of myself. This was the Black Templar way, the doctrine I had been taught and shown and forced to internalize. When doubt emerged, you did not debate it or examine it or attempt to understand it. You killed it with the same ruthless efficiency you would bring to killing a heretic. Doubt was the enemy. Question was the adversary. Uncertainty was corruption. The self that harbored these things must be destroyed so that a purer self could emerge. And this process of destruction and reconstruction continued throughout a Templar's life. Each crisis of faith resolved through obliteration rather than resolution. I understood this doctrine perfectly. I had seen it demonstrated in the corrections and flagellations and meditations, the systematic dismantling of personality, until only function remained. I had felt it working on myself, each prayer and ritual stripping away another layer of identity, each act of violence, cementing the replacement self that existed only to serve. The whispers were showing me what I had become and what I was losing, offering a final chance to choose differently, to preserve some fragment of the person I had been before the black and white. But preservation required rebellion, and rebellion was unthinkable. The contradiction formed a knot I could not untie, a theological trap that tightened the more I struggled against it. To resist the doctrine was to prove myself unworthy of the brotherhood. To accept the doctrine was to surrender the capacity to resist. There was no middle ground, no compromise position, no way to be partially devoted or conditionally faithful. The Black Templars demanded totality, and totality meant the death of everything that was not absolute certainty. The 9th week brought us to the capital city, where the final heretic stronghold waited. This was the planetary cathedral, a structure so vast it could be seen from orbit, its spires reaching kilometers into the sky, its foundations extending deep into the planet's crust. The heretics had fortified it, turning sacred architecture into a fortress, filling its halls with thousands of cultists ready to die for their false gods. Our orders were simple: assault the cathedral, fight to its heart, destroy the corruption at its source. Casualties were irrelevant. Speed was irrelevant. Only purity mattered. The reclamation of holy ground from blasphemous occupation. We assembled in the ruins of a pilgrim's plaza, what remained of our strike force gathering for final briefing. Of the 200 initiates who had descended in the first wave, 43 survived. The rest were dead or too wounded to fight. Their bodies returned to the oath unbroken for whatever funeral rites were deemed appropriate. I stood among the survivors, my armor scarred and dented, my weapons worn from constant use, my body carrying injuries that had healed poorly or not at all. Around me, brothers I barely recognized anymore, their faces hardened into expressions of permanent fury, their eyes reflecting nothing but the readiness for violence. Sword Brother Kale addressed us without preamble. He spoke of honor and duty and the Emperor's will. His words the same ones we had heard before every engagement, their familiarity transforming them into ritual rather than inspiration. We would storm the cathedral at dawn. We would purge every level, every chamber, every hidden passage. We would show no mercy, because mercy was weakness and weakness was corruption. We would fight until victory or death, the distinction between those outcomes being ultimately meaningless given that both served the Emperor's purpose. I listened with half my attention. The other half focused on the whispers that had grown stronger in recent days. They spoke now, even in the presence of others, a constant murmur beneath the surface of reality, questioning every order, every doctrine, every assumption I had been taught to treat as absolute truth. They pointed out that the cathedral had been holy ground for 10,000 years before this corruption, that its stones had been sanctified by the faith of billions, that destroying it room by room in the name of purity was itself a kind of desecration. They suggested that the heretics were victims as much as villains, their corruption the result of abandonment by an Imperium too vast to care for individual worlds. They asked whether our purge was justice, or merely revenge dressed in theological language. Each whisper felt like acid eating through the foundations of my faith. I wanted to reject them, to reassert the certainties I had been given, but the words rang hollow now, even in my own thoughts. I had killed hundreds, maybe thousands, and I could not recall a single face among the dead, could not distinguish between the heretics and the pilgrims they had once been, could not separate the necessity of the slaughter from the simple fact of enjoying the power it gave me. Somewhere in the course of this campaign, I had stopped being a warrior defending the innocent and become simply a killer who happened to be killing the officially designated targets. The distinction mattered. It mattered more than tactical efficiency or strategic necessity or any of the other justifications the doctrine provided. It mattered because it was the difference between serving the emperor and serving the violence itself, between faith and fanaticism, between purpose and nihilism. And I no longer knew which side of those distinctions I occupied. The assault began with the dawn, though dawn on Sanctus Lachma was a gray and cheerless thing. We advanced toward the cathedral in serried ranks, our weapons ready, our prayers forming a wall of sound that preceded us. The heretics met us at the gates, pouring out in waves that broke against our formation like water against stone. We killed them mechanically, efficiently, without passion or pause, our training overriding any impulse toward hesitation or mercy. The stairs leading to the main entrance became slick with blood. The great doors carved with scenes of the emperor's triumph were battered down with explosives. We entered the cathedral as conquerors entering enemy territory, every instinct tuned toward threat detection and elimination. The interior was a nightmare of corrupted grandeur. What had once been magnificent now bore the stain of blasphemy. Every surface defaced, every icon altered, every holy space transformed into something obscene. The heretics had been busy during their occupation, rewriting the cathedral's visual language, turning its celebration of faith into mockery. I saw statues of saints with their faces replaced by demonic visages. I saw altars where offerings of blood still pulled, fresh and dark. I saw murals depicting the emperor's defeat rather than his triumph. The paint still wet, suggesting the work had been ongoing until our arrival interrupted it. The whispers screamed in triumph, vindicated by the evidence of corruption. They pointed out that this desecration was exactly what happened when faith became rigid rather than living. When doctrine replaced thought, when certainty became more important than truth, they insisted that the cathedral's fall was a symptom rather than a disease. Evidence of the Imperium's failure to nurture genuine devotion among its subjects. They argued that our response, violent purification, without understanding, would solve nothing, that we would reclaim a building while leaving the conditions that allowed its corruption unchanged, and I found myself unable to disagree with any of this. The realization struck me physically, a weight settling in my chest that made breathing difficult. I was in the middle of a holy crusade, surrounded by my brothers, engaged in righteous battle against corruption, and I could not muster the certainty that what we were doing was right. I could acknowledge it was necessary within the framework of imperial doctrine. I could recognize it as tactically sound and strategically appropriate, but I could not feel in my bones that the emperor truly demanded this particular violence in this particular way. The doubt was complete. It was not a question of whether our enemies deserved death. It was not uncertainty about the reality of corruption or the threat it posed. It was something deeper, a fundamental questioning of whether the Black Templar approach to faith, the systematic destruction of the self in pursuit of purity, was actually what the emperor intended or merely what the chapter had decided he intended. It was the awful suspicion that we had become so obsessed with being worthy that we had forgotten to ask what we were supposed to be worthy for. We fought our way deeper into the cathedral, each chamber purchased with blood. The heretics died in heaps. My brothers fell one by one, their deaths unremarked except as gaps in our formation that closed automatically. The living stepping over the dead without pause. I fought alongside Kale, following his lead, executing his orders. My body performing the mechanical actions of combat, while my mind spiraled through increasingly dangerous territory. Each kill felt hollow. Each prayer felt like reciting words in a foreign language. Each moment of the battle emphasized the growing disconnect between what I was doing and what I believed, between the warrior others saw and the fractured soul that inhabited the armor. In a chapel dedicated to Saint Ducis, I made a terrible mistake. A group of heretics had fortified the space using pews and overturned statues to create defensive positions. We assaulted with standard tactics, suppressing fire followed by close assault. Our chainswords making short work of wooden barricades. I killed 3 cultists in quick succession. Their deaths, so routine I barely registered them as separate events. Then I saw the 4th, a young woman, her robes torn, her face painted with symbols, her eyes wide with terror rather than fanaticism. She cowered against the wall, weaponless, clearly no threat. The doctrine was clear. No mercy, no exceptions. Corruption must be purged regardless of apparent innocence. I raised my bolt pistol, the weapon steady in my hand, the targeting solution trivial at this range. The woman stared at me, not pleading, simply waiting, already resigned to death. My finger tightened on the trigger. The whispers screamed at me to stop, to question, to recognize her humanity. The doctrine screamed at me to fire, to execute the Emperor's will, to eliminate the corruption. I hesitated. For perhaps 3 seconds, I stood frozen, unable to reconcile what I had been taught with what I was seeing. The conflict between doctrine and instinct, creating a paralysis that rendered me useless. Kale noticed. He turned from his own combat, saw the woman, saw me standing motionless, and understood immediately what was happening. His expression hardened into something beyond anger. Disappointment mixed with recognition. The look of a teacher whose student has revealed fundamental unsuitability for the lesson. He fired his bolt pistol, speaking the judgment I could not deliver. The woman exploded, her body too fragile to contain the force of the explosive round. Kyle approached me slowly, his weapon still smoking, his eyes locked on mine. Around us, the battle continued. But in this moment, we existed in a bubble of terrible intimacy. Teacher and student, examiner and examined, the sword brother, evaluating whether the initiate before him could be salvaged or must be discarded. He asked me a single question. Why did you hesitate? The truth would condemn me, but lying to a superior was itself heresy. I told him that I had doubted, that I had looked at the woman and seen a human rather than corruption, that I had wondered if the Emperor truly demanded her death. I told him about the whispers, about the questions that plagued my meditations, about the growing certainty that something in the Black Templar doctrine was fundamentally wrong. Even if I could not articulate what, I confessed my corruption fully, holding nothing back, knowing that transparency was the only slim chance I had for redemption or mercy. Kale listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, the sounds of battle providing a grim soundtrack to whatever judgment he was formulating. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying a weariness I had never heard from him before. He told me that every Templar experienced what I was experiencing, that the doubts and whispers were not unique to me, but a universal trial, the soul's last desperate attempt to preserve itself before being fully transformed. He told me that the choice I faced was simple. I could cling to these doubts and become corrupted, my wavering faith eventually turning me into the very heresy I was meant to oppose. Or I could do what every successful Templar had done before me and kill the part of myself that doubted, not suppress it, not overcome it, kill it. He explained that the Black Templar path was not about becoming stronger in your faith, but about becoming the faith itself. The individual dissolved completely into the doctrine. The self extinguished, so that only the Emperor's will remained. He told me that the man I used to be, the Roderick Vane, who could feel grief and ask questions and hesitate before pulling triggers, was already dead, had died the moment I took my oaths, and that I was merely witnessing the corpse's final spasms of autonomy. He said that my choice was whether to accept this death and be reborn as a true Templar, or to reject it and prove myself unworthy of the chapter. There was no compassion in his voice, but there was also no cruelty. This was simply fact delivered with the same neutral precision he might use to describe weapon maintenance procedures. Kyle was not threatening me or attempting to manipulate me. He was explaining the reality of what I had joined, the price that membership demanded, the transformation that awaited anyone who truly committed to the path. And he was waiting to see if I had the strength to pay that price, or if I would reveal myself as fundamentally insufficient. I asked him if there was truly no alternative, no middle path between absolute certainty and utter corruption. He answered that the question itself proved I did not understand that faith was not a spectrum, but a binary, that you either served the Emperor with every fiber of your being, or you served the enemy regardless of your intentions. He told me that the universe was engaged in an eternal war between order and chaos, that there was no neutral ground, that hesitation and doubt were not harmless philosophical positions, but active contributions to humanity's destruction. He insisted that the Black Templars' approach was not cruelty, but necessity, not fanaticism, but the only rational response to a cosmos that offered no quarter to the weak or uncertain. And then he gave me my final test. He pointed to a doorway across the chapel, beyond which we could hear the sounds of heretics preparing a defense. He told me to go through that door, to kill every enemy I found there, and to do it without hesitation, without question, without the whispers being able to slow my hand even for a moment. He said that if I could do this, could demonstrate absolute commitment through action, then I might yet be salvaged. But if I hesitated again, if I allowed doubt to interfere with duty, then I would prove myself too corrupted to continue, and he would be forced to purge me alongside the heretics. The ultimatum was clear. Kill the doubt or be killed as doubt's victim. I looked at the doorway, feeling the weight of every choice that had led me to this moment. Every prayer recited and punishment endured and act of violence committed. I thought about the man I had been before the black and white, whose face I could no longer remember, whose emotions had become abstract memories disconnected from living feeling. I thought about what I would become if I continued down this path. The complete dissolution of self, the transformation into a weapon that happened to be shaped like a human. I thought about the alternative, death, or worse than death. Whatever fate the chapter reserved for those whose faith proved insufficient, the whispers offered no guidance now. Having said all they needed to say, they had shown me the truth of what I was becoming. They had illuminated the cost of absolute certainty. They had offered a choice, even if both options led to kinds of death. Now they fell silent, leaving me alone with the decision, the selection between two endings, neither of which preserved the person making the choice. I activated my chainsaw and walked through the doorway. The chamber beyond held perhaps 20 heretics, armed and waiting, their corrupted faces twisted into expressions of defiant hatred. I did not pause. I did not analyze. I did not allow any space between perception and action where doubt might insert itself. I simply killed, moving through them like a scythe through wheat. The chainsaw screaming its hymn while my bolt pistol barked counterpoint. Bodies fell blood-sprayed, screams echoed and died. I felt nothing except the rhythms of combat, the familiar patterns of strike and dodge and strike again. My training overriding everything else, reducing me to pure function. When the last heretic collapsed, I stood in silence among the dead. Blood dripped from my armor, forming puddles on the ancient stone. My weapons cooled, their mechanisms clicking as they returned to idle states. My breathing slowed from combat pace to something approaching normal. And inside, where a soul should have resided, I felt only emptiness, a vast hollow space where Roderick Vane had once lived and now existed only as a name attached to a weapon. Cale appeared in the doorway, surveying the carnage with approval. He told me I had done well, that I had proven myself capable of the commitment required, that I had taken the first true step toward becoming a Black Templar rather than merely an initiate wearing the colors. He clapped me on the shoulder, the gesture almost paternal, and led me back to the others to continue the purge. I followed without comment, my face set in the same expression of rigid determination I had seen on so many others, the mask having finally become the face, the performance having replaced the performer. The campaign concluded 3 days later when we reached the cathedral's heart and destroyed the final heretical altar. Of our original 200 initiates, 19 survived. The casualties were deemed acceptable. The mission was declared a success. Sanctus LRA had been purged, its corruption burned away, its temples reclaimed for the Emperor. That most of those temples were now ruins was irrelevant. Purity mattered more than preservation, and we had delivered purity through total destruction. We returned to the oath unbroken as victors, our armor stained with the proof of our devotion. The chapters celebrated our success with prayers and ceremonies. The dead initiates remembered in litanies that reduced them to names and numbers. I stood among the survivors, receiving the same benedictions and acknowledgments as the others, my exterior indistinguishable from theirs. Inside, the whispers had fallen completely silent. Not defeated, but simply unnecessary. Now that I had made my choice, now that I had demonstrated my willingness to murder the part of myself capable of questioning, I was awarded the right to begin training for power armor, the next step toward becoming a full battle brother. This honor was received without joy or pride, simply noted and accepted as another duty, another responsibility in the endless chain of obligations that defined existence aboard the Crusade fleet. I would train, I would pray, I would fight, I would kill whatever enemies the Imperium designated. And I would do all of this with absolute commitment, without hesitation, without the interference of doubt or conscience or any other weakness. The man who might have questioned this path was dead, killed not by heretics or in battle, but by my own hand, executed in that chapel when I chose to walk through the doorway rather than refuse. Roderick Vane, whoever he had been before the black and white, existed now only as a ghost, a fading memory of someone who had briefly worn my face before being systematically dismantled and replaced with something more useful, more pure, more capable of the absolute violence that the Emperor's service demanded. And the terrible truth that I carried forward, the knowledge that made me exactly what the Black Templars required, was that I did not regret this death, could not mourn this loss, felt nothing but grim satisfaction at having successfully completed my own execution. This was the horror of being a Black Templar. Not the battles, though those were horrific. Not the enemies, though those were monstrous. Not the violence, though that was endless. The true horror was the realization that you volunteered for this, that you walked willingly into a system designed to destroy everything you were, that you cooperated with your own obliteration because the alternative was to admit that perhaps absolute certainty was not worth the price of absolute self-annihilation. I stand now in the chapel where I have stood 1,000 times, reciting prayers I have recited 10,000 times, wearing armor that bears the scars of 100 battles fought in the Emperor's name. My face, reflected in polished steel, shows nothing of the person I used to be. My eyes hold no questions, only the cold certainty of one who has killed every doubt and found in the resulting emptiness a kind of peace. Others might call this a tragedy, the loss of humanity in pursuit of purity. I call it necessity, the price that must be paid, the transformation that service requires. And in the deepest darkness of my mind, in a place so hidden that even I rarely acknowledge its existence, a tiny fragment of whoever I used to be whispers that both of these things can be true, that tragedy and necessity are not opposites, but twins, that the horror is real even when the duty is genuine, and that I will carry this knowledge forward into every battle, every prayer, every moment of the endless crusade. A wound that never heals, hidden beneath armor that will never be removed. This is what it means to be a Black Templar. This is the life I have chosen, or the life that has chosen me. The distinction no longer meaningful when the result is the same. A weaponing human shape. Faith preserved through the murder of the faithful. Purity achieved through the total destruction of everything that made purity worth pursuing. The bells ring calling us to evening prayer, and I go without hesitation, my feet carrying me through familiar corridors toward familiar devotions. The routine, so ingrained that consciousness becomes optional. The performance, continuing long after the performer has left the stage.